Practically Imperfect Life. If it's your first time here, welcome to my channel. My name's Abby. I'm a homeschooling mom of 2 high school students. And today I'm starting what I hope will become a series over the next couple of months where I kind of hone in on how it is I prepare for and teach particular subjects. This was something that I was really trying to find resources for when my kids were entering middle school and high school, and I found very few resources out there. I mean, there were videos where people were sharing their curriculum, or they do like a curriculum flip through and show you kind of the inside of the books, but very little explanation as far as how they took that curriculum and turned it into a lesson, or what they pulled from it and actually taught their kids. And I felt like that was something that I just really wanted. I wanted somebody to show me, like, how do I make this curriculum work? And since I couldn't find those resources, I had to just trial and error it and find a way that worked for us. So hopefully I can save you all some time and frustration by just sharing some of the ways that I teach different subjects. Today I'm going to focus particularly on literature and how I teach literature using BJU Press. Now, you may or may not choose to use BJU for your high school literature, but I think some of the techniques as far as how I pull out what I find is important in the units and in the textbooks, and then turn that into a lesson for my students is something that you really can kind of apply to different curriculums. For example, my daughter doesn't use BJU for literature. She uses Apologia this year, and she used Excellence in Literature last year. But the way I taught those to her, the techniques I used were similar to what I used when I was teaching both her and my son BJU in middle school. And so I'm going to be taking you through a little bit of the teacher book that I received when I ordered my BJU materials for my son, and showing you kind of what I utilize from there and what I pull from and how it is I plan out and do a lesson with him. So first I want to start off by just showing you the teacher guide here for BJU. So the 9th grade literature program is called Fundamentals in Literature, and the setup for BJU literature is very similar from year to year, particularly the middle school and the high school years. So if your student likes kind of the familiarity of knowing how a textbook is set up and what types of assignments to expect and things like that, you may enjoy the fact that, BJU has that continuity through all of their different levels. Obviously, the types of questions, the types of reading materials and things like that get more difficult year to year, but there is just a sense of just kind of basic understanding on what to expect with the curriculum. And my son has liked that, and so that's why we stuck with BJU for him. There are a couple different ways you can purchase BJU on their website. They do have a distance learning course. It's a combination, the distance learning course, of literature, writing, and grammar. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time we utilized that, they had it set up where you had roughly 90 days of literature lectures and roughly 90 days of writing and grammar lectures. So they had it kind of split up where it was almost one semester of one and one semester of the other. We use a different program for writing and grammar. We use IEW products. So after doing 1 year where we purchased the distance learning course and only used the literature part, it just didn't seem very cost effective for us to do that going forward, because those distance learning courses are expensive. Not that they're bad. I mean, we use them for some other subjects, but if we're not utilizing all of it, it just didn't make sense to pay for it. You can then purchase the books, separate or together. You can get their writing and grammar book, or you can just get their literature book. So that's what we do. And when you order it, you get a student textbook, which has the same cover as the teacher book. And then you get 2 parts to the teacher book, a part A, part B. And then they do come with a CD that has like all of the different resources that you can print out. And I'll be showing you what some of those resources look like, and again, how we work those into a lesson plan. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to be flipping the camera around, and I'm going to show you again some of the inside of the teacher guide and how it is that I utilize that for lesson planning. So this is the teacher guide for the BJU literature program. So again, we're doing 9th grade fundamentals of literature. When I ordered this, I received 2 books, book A and book B. In the back of book A is my resource CD. This is where I get all of my worksheets that I can print off. Now there's a lot of great resources within this book for me as the teacher to use, So the scope and sequence here is something that I look at both at the beginning of the year and then when we're getting ready to start a unit. I mentioned that we like BJU because the setup is very similar year to year, and typically we see it divided up into 6 units that you cover over the course of the year, each with its own theme or main concept. So this year in 9th grade, he's covering conflict, character, theme, point of view, structure, and tone. Now we're getting ready to start Unit 3, which is theme. And I can see on here, they do have writing assignments that are optional. We skip those because we're using an IEW writing program. But I can see the genres that he's going to be reading from. So prose, fiction, and poetry. For example, from prose fiction, he's going to read a folk tale, a fairy tale, and a short story. And then over here, this column that's literary terms and concepts, this is what I really look at because I want to make sure that I know what are these key things that I need to make sure he is learning this unit. So these are typically going to be keywords that at some point he's going to be finding the definition for, and that will likely be included on the test as well. And a lot of the questions that we go over will see how well he is identifying these. So Unit 3, we're going to talk about theme, universal theme, authorial intent, moral, allegory, symbol, irony, situational irony, verbal irony, and dramatic irony. Now I know that we have talked about some of these before in previous years, but given how we saw that our first 2 units went, I know that we're going to dive deeper into these, and it kind of expands upon what he already knew. Now there are other things you can look at in the teacher guide. You know, if you're interested in where things line up with national standards and whatnot, you can look at that. But I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead and show you what helps me out the most. This is the suggested syllabus. There is a version that's a 90-day syllabus, or there's a version that's 180 days. And that's the one that I look at. I look at this more closely at the beginning of the year when I'm doing lesson planning, because they do fill it for 180 days, but I want to do novel studies in addition to this, so full books and book studies. So I will look for what I can cut out. Anything that says it's a writing lesson, I cut that out. When there are these whole long weeks for midterm and final reviews, we don't do the midterm exams or the final exams, so I cut those out. And then I look for things that I can combine together. For example, it has 2 days dedicated to a 3-page poem. Well, we don't need 2 days to go over that short poem, so we'll combine that and we'll just do that in 1 day. And by going through and doing that, I usually can free up enough days to do 3 full novel studies that last 3 to 4 weeks apiece during the course of the year, in addition to what we're doing with this. So the syllabus in the back is really helpful, at least for getting you started with your lesson planning. Let me go ahead and take you to Unit 3, because this is what we're getting ready to start. Each unit gives a couple of pages of introduction into what it is we're going to be talking about. There's a picture study, tells you about the picture, and it's kind of an interesting way to introduce that topic. But then this 2-page spread, again, they have one for each of the units, really gets kind of into the meat and potatoes of what it is we're going to be looking at. There will be these bold words that I will have him go ahead and copy down into the notebook that he keeps for literature and have him write the definition down. And the definitions can be found right within the reading. So I'll make sure that he's writing these down because these are terms we need to know. And then when we get to the stories themselves, there are a lot of great resources in the teacher guide that you can kind of pick and choose from and decide what it is you would like to use. What I really have found is that the way they have this set up, it almost is set up as if you were teaching this to a classroom, or if you were going to be reading the story out loud with your student, stopping and talking about different points. If you find that your student struggles with just silent reading and reading comprehension, and they do better when things are read out loud and discussed in small pieces, you may choose to do it in that way. I have my son silently read this and then we go back and we discuss, but you could really utilize it either way. Before I assign it out to him, I will read the story myself. I have found that if I don't, then I am not very well prepared in order to help him when he has questions, or to be able to confidently, guide him through the questions.
Now, none of these stories are very long, you know, they're a couple pages each. And so I'll usually the night before it's assigned, I'll just read through it to make sure that I am familiar with the story. And then I'll look through these different pieces of information that are provided and decide which ones I want to use. One thing I wanted to show you that I think is really cool is that in the teacher guide, we will have these colored sections highlighted. So you see they're all color coded, and they will correlate to a little note that's on the side explaining kind of why that's highlighted and what it's talking about. So for example, this one here, we have a phrase that's highlighted, and over here it explains that that's an example of a hyperbole, and it tells you kind of how that adds to the story. Over here we have another highlighted section, and this tells me this is an example of foreshadowing. I like this because when I'm preparing for the questions that I'm going to show you here in a minute, if I need him to be able to find an example somewhere within the story, I can just put like a sticky note or something here and see where it's been pointed out in the teacher guide and be able to help kind of guide him to that page so he's not kind of blindly searching through the whole story. The teacher guides always give us objectives, and it tells you the support materials for that story. I'll show you which ones I use and on what days, but it does tell you which things are on the CD that you can utilize. There is a preparation section which gives you a bit of background on the author, historical contents and context and things like that. The story or poem or whatever type of work that they're reading, the introduction I like to read out loud to him. I feel like it's short, but it gives some good information just to kind of get them understanding who's the author, where's the story taking place, why is it important, and it's just a good little guide. So I do read that. And then I will kind of pick and choose from the discussion and analysis and participation sections and decide what things I want to use. The discussion is probably the one that I go to the most because I like us to talk through stories, and I feel like that's really my best way of knowing that he understands what this particular story is trying to teach him. But you can kind of glance through it and decide how you want to do it. Some kids are more tactile learners, and so maybe having some of these participation, like write out the answer or draw out the answer activities would be more suited for your student. You could do this on like a whiteboard or a chalkboard or piece of paper or whatever, but it has the options in there. And it will have that like throughout the whole story. So you see there's more color-coded sections and more points here, and there'll be breakdowns where there's different discussion parts. The reason I think why they have so many different discussion sections is because in their syllabus they do have these stories broken down over multiple days. If you want to incorporate Bible, you could do the scriptural application. We don't, unless it's usually part of the discussion questions, because we have our own Bibles unit that we do, but you could really incorporate this into your Bible study if you would like to. So he'll read the story here. Oh, one other thing I'll kind of point out, you see, these are probably really hard to see, but there's like the two little lines with a word in between and a definition. BJU Literature does have its own vocabulary lists and vocabulary quizzes. So if you aren't using another vocabulary program and you want to utilize this, you can have them, find these words as they go through the story, make flashcards or whatever to start to memorize them and then do a quiz. We did do that in 6th and 7th grade. And then we switched over to using some different vocabulary because I just wanted to do more than just what was in the books, but it is in there. But at the end of every story, they have this section called About the Story. Now this is something that's different that I've noticed in the high school books versus the middle school books. The middle school books, instead of ending with an about the story, ended each section with what we call a thinking zone, which there's still a part of the high school program, it's just not as frequent. But the about the story is essentially like a list of questions that you can go over with your student. Now you might choose to have them do it on their own, but we do these as part of a discussion because I want to make sure, like in the moment on that day, does he understand the main points of this story? In my teacher guide, for each question over on the side, it tells me what type of question it is. And there's 3 types typically. There's a critical thinking type of question where they have to kind of dig deeper, maybe apply some things that we've been talking about to get the answer. There's interpretive questions where there's not necessarily a right or wrong, it's what are their thoughts or their opinions on things. And then there's literal questions, and that's where it's, okay, there was an explicit answer in the story. What is that answer? You know, typically that type of question will be like, who's the protagonist? What's the main conflict? What was the, what was an example of foreshadowing in the story? Something where, there was a particular answer they needed to look for. And then it gives you an example of what those are. So I will make sure I've read the questions when I'm reading the story, and I will read over the answers. If I need to, be able to reference back to where that answer is found in the story, that's when I'll pull out my sticky notes and I will go ahead and kind of mark the page where I found that answer. So when he's answering these, if he's struggling to find that, I can say, well, how about you go check out this particular page, and I'll see if he can identify it then on that page. But we will go through these, read each question, have him answer it out loud, and then I have him write his answers down into his notebook. So he'll write down the name of the story, and then he'll write down his answers. The reason why we do this is because so many of these questions later become test questions, and they also, teach the main points from that story or the main objectives. Now, every couple of stories, there is a thinking zone page. So again, these are more common in the middle school ones. So it was a little change for us with the high school ones where this wasn't after every story. But the thinking zone will introduce more of the kind of literary terms that you need to know. So they're in here in bold. And again, the definition is worked into the reading. So I have him read this on his own, copy down the bold words with their definitions, and then we'll discuss the questions. The questions will build upon what literary terms are talked about in the thinking zone. So this particular one that he's going to get to will talk about allegories and symbols. And so the questions here will reference back to that. And it even, bold faces the literary term in that question. So question 2, for example, says the story of Beauty and the Beast qualifies as an allegory, teaching several truths about life. What do you think the characters of Beauty and the Beast stand for in the story? What lessons do they help us understand? So he has to know what the meaning of an allegory is to be able to answer this question. And then again, over here, it tells me the type of question it is and the answers. So I heavily rely on this book to help me out with that, particularly, when we're doing poetry, because I'm just no good at poetry. It doesn't matter how much I try. But when we have poetry, they do a really nice job of breaking down the poems for you, the teacher, so you can then teach it to the student and then, lining out the questions. So that's what we will utilize within that. So he reads the story. We do the about the story or about the poem questions, write those in the notebook. And then if there's the thinking zone, he'll read it. We'll go over the terms, and then we will go through the questions. I don't, count him wrong if he's answering a question out loud and he gets it wrong. I do give him credit for doing these discussion sessions with me because I want him to participate. If he's just sitting there and not wanting to do anything, well, then that's not participating. But as long as he's trying, then we're in good shape. Now, when he starts to get near the end of a unit, the book does have a really nice unit review. Again, for the teacher, it tells you kind of where or what kind of questions it is that it's asking. It talks to you about like how we're looking to apply concepts, and it gives you all of the answers to these unit review questions. This is, again, something we do out loud together. So we'll go through, I'll ask him, to tell me the definition of these terms to make sure he understands them. We'll, go through the different types of questions. They're a very good preparation for the test that BJU does. The one thing I do like is that the literary tests aren't some sort of, surprise where you've never seen any of these questions that it's asking before. The questions on the test pull heavily from the unit review and from the about the story questions that we have done. So that's why I find those so important to go over with him every day. Now, you can print off the worksheets from the literature CD, and I print them all off at the start of the year because I like to just get it out of the way, and I put it into the binder here for him. There's a couple different types of worksheets that it includes, and we don't use all of them. For example, we don't use any of the vocabulary worksheets because we have a separate vocabulary program. We also don't use any of the writing worksheets, but we do use the practice tests, the quizzes, and the teacher helper pages. So the practice tests is a standardized text practice, and it's just comprehension questions for the most part, similar to what they might see on a standardized test. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, is just to prepare them for those types of questions. Even though we don't have to do standardized testing here in Indiana, I do like him to go ahead and do this so he can just have some extra practice. The teacher helper pages, there will be some stories where there's no teacher helper pages, some stories where there's 2, and each one is a little bit different. For example, this one, Teacher Helper 3A, this goes with the Silver Mine, the first story, as well as Teacher Helper 3B. So I'll have both of those. The activities on here, again, are meant to kind of reference back to those key literary terms and concepts he's supposed to be learning for the unit. This I have him do on his own, but of course he can ask for help if he doesn't understand or if he, is struggling with a concept. All of the answer keys for these are on the CD. I save them to my computer so I can more quickly pull them up and reference them if he has a question, rather than printing them all out. But here, this one for our first story, it says, in the Silver Mine, the parson and the townspeople have the opportunity to gain riches. In the boxes below, briefly explain how each character or group of characters responds to the good fortune. So we're looking at the motivations and responses of different people in our story. And then it says, given the responses of the characters to wealth, what 2 main lessons do you think the parson is trying to teach the king about his present circumstances? So when you understand like these main lessons, you are understanding the theme of that story. And this whole unit is about themes. So I like how it ties it in here. This one here, we're going to be looking at types of conflict. He's studied conflict in Unit 1, and this is just a great review of that. So identifying different types of conflicts in story. So man versus man, man versus himself, which characters were involved, and then how were those problems resolved. So for each conflict he finds, he has to show what the resolution was. So this is just a really great review. The quizzes, if you look at the teacher guide, it gives you the quiz number the day of the story. And I think originally they intend for you to have them do the quiz the same day as the story. I actually have him do this the next day because I want to see how much he remembered from the story. The quiz questions are more literal questions. Like this is kind of straightforward. Did you read the story? Because if you didn't read the story, you can't answer the questions. Who is this character? Where did this character go? What did this character do? It's direct answers. There's no interpretation or anything like that in most of these quizzes. They're pretty straightforward. So I'll have him do this the following day. So once he'll read the Silver Mine one day and do the teacher helper pages and the discussion questions. And then the next day before he reads the new story, he'll do the quiz on the Silver Mine to see what he remembers from the day before. Most of these are going to be 1-word answers or a couple word answers. It's a pretty quick and easy quiz to do each day. And they're all 5 questions. It's always the same number. For timing wise, it probably takes me about 15 minutes the night before at most to read the story and glance through the answers, glance through the discussion pages, and just make sure that I'm prepared. That's really all the time it takes for me each evening. Typical day, his literature might take him 20 to 30 minutes to complete. The reading sections are usually pretty short. Our discussions take 5 to 7 minutes to go over. And then it really just depends on how many worksheets he has. If he just has the quiz, that only takes him a few minutes. If he's got a teacher helper worksheet, depending on how involved those teacher helper sheets are, those might take him a little bit more time. And from there, then he can go on to the other portions of his English class, his grammar and his writing and his vocabulary and so on. So, but that is how I take our curriculum and turn it into a lesson plan for the day, or, you know, how I teach that particular day's lesson with my son.
All right, guys, that pretty much wraps it up for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope it was helpful just to see how one homeschooling parent takes the curriculum and actually turns it into lesson plans and does that preparation work. Again, you have to adapt things to make them work best for your student and your homeschool and your goals. But I just wanted to give you one example of how it can be done and what we have found has worked out well for us. If you have any questions at all, whether that be about the BJU curriculum in general, the literature books, how I do lesson planning, anything like that, please feel free to leave a comment below and I will try to answer your questions. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe below to my channel so you can be notified when I post new homeschooling and mom life content. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great one.